Welcome to the China Report, a new show made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Our understanding of China and U.S. China relations has become a defining feature of all global politics. Every week, we'll help you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of a country that we have been taught to hate, but know so very little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee, along with my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited to talk about our main story, but first, let's kick it off with the headlines.
China's State Council promulgated a set of rare earth management regulations designed to protect and rationally develop rare earth resources, promote development of the industry, maintain ecological security, and ensure national security. These regulations apply to mining, processing, import, and export of rare earth minerals. These regulations are set to go into effect of October of this year. The rare earth minerals or elements refer to the 17 elements of the lanthanide grouping on the periodic chart that are essential for the manufacture of specific high-tech and clean-tech components, and they're considered to be of strategic importance. Currently, China mines about 60% of rare earth metals and processes nearly 90%, including 99.9% of all heavy rare earth minerals. It also has a near monopoly on industrial refining, holding 23,000 patents, more than the United States. July 1st was the 27th anniversary of the return of Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. The People's Liberation Army in Hong Kong opened its garrison doors to the public to celebrate this return, with thousands of people attending various exhibitions and demonstrations. For 150 years, Hong Kong was a British colony originally taken from China as a punitive war concession after the Opium War in 1841. The Chinese had opposed the trafficking of opium into China by the British and confiscated and burned 20,000 chests of opium. The British went to war to punish China and extracted Hong Kong Island as a colony in settlement, from which it continued its drug trafficking. In 1997, the lease on the new territories expired, and the British returned Hong Kong to China, which became a special administrative region retaining some unique rights and legacy structures. Chinese institutions dominate the top spots for research, with 7 out of the 10 leading research institutions based in China. Notable Western institutions like Stanford University were nudged out by the Chinese. The Chinese Academy of Sciences took the top spot with 6 other Chinese institutes, including the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences, the University of Science and Technology of China, Peking, Nanjing, Zhejiang, and Tsinghua universities also taking top spots. Chinese universities and research institutions have recently been dominating all major international indices and indexes in science and technology. Chinese scientists at Tianjin University and the Southern University of Science and Technology have developed a robot with an artificial brain grown from stem cells. Tissue from stem cells is combined with a neural interface chip that powers the robot. The robot can then be taught to perform various tasks such as gripping objects and maneuvering around obstacles. Tianjin University stated it was the world's first open source brain on chip intelligent complex information interaction system, and it could eventually lead to hybrid human robot intelligence as well as potential treatments for neurodevelopmental disorders and restoring brain function after brain damage.
China becomes first country to retrieve rocks from the moon's far side. Last Tuesday, China made spaceflight history when its robotic Chang'e 6 mission returned to Earth and brought back soil samples from the far side of the moon. The return capsule landed in China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region after a 53-day mission. Space missions to date conducted by China, the Soviet Union, and the US have all brought back samples from the near side of the moon. But the far side is much more difficult to explore, and this is the first time in human history samples have been brought back. Lang Xiao, a planetary geologist at China University of Geosciences, said, "This is a major event for scientists worldwide and a cause for celebration for all of humanity." Breakthrough by Shanghai doctors uses stem cells to cure diabetes. Doctors in Shanghai have achieved a medical breakthrough, curing a 59-year-old patient's diabetes through transplanting pancreatic cells, which were obtained through stem cells. The man had type 2 diabetes for over 25 years and received the transplant in July of 2021. After the transplant, the patient was weaned off insulin and oral drugs over the course of a year. A paper about the medical breakthrough was recently published in a scientific journal. China expels ousted defense chiefs in corruption crackdown. Chinese news agencies announced that two former defense ministers, Li Shangfu and his predecessor Wei Fenghe, have been expelled by Communist Party of China leadership for, quote, serious violation of party discipline and the law, and deprived of their qualifications as delegates to the 20th National Congress of the CPC. According to Chinese news sources, an investigation found that Li and Wei exploited their positions by accepting gifts and large sums of money, and both are suspected of offering bribes, among other allegations. And now to our main story. A couple weeks ago, Reuters published a bombshell investigation which revealed that the Pentagon, between 2020 and 2021, at the height of the COVID pandemic, they launched an anti-vax online propaganda campaign to undermine China's SINOVAC vaccine in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. China's SINOVAC vaccine was the first COVID vaccine that was made available in the Philippines. This campaign involved creating fake hashtags, creating fake social media accounts to spread misinformation. It sowed doubt regarding the efficacy of SINOVAC. It sowed doubt regarding the efficacy of test kits and masks. They also spread disinformation targeting Muslims, claiming that SINOVAC contained pork gelatin. So, KJ, I'm really excited to delve into this story with you. It's a bombshell report that, in my opinion, didn't really get nearly as much coverage as it should have, which is why we're talking about it today. But before we really get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to hear your initial thoughts about this report.
Yes, Amanda, this is an extraordinary story, an extraordinary revelation, and it truly is a bombshell. What it points out is that the US simply had no limits to what it was willing to do in order to delegitimate China. That is to say, this story shows that the US was willing to let tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people die in order to undermine China's efforts to help the Philippines manage its COVID response. And I think that just shows the extraordinary, unethical position of the United States as it escalates to war against China.
Yeah, this is a really alarming report, and I don't think that can be overstated. By November of 2021, around 50,000 people in the Philippines had succumbed to COVID. And this campaign was really, really effective. The Philippines had, one of the worst inoculation rates in Asia. It was to the point where the president was threatening people with arrest for not getting vaccinated. And we have to think about the long-term effects of something like this because, that's something that we won't even begin to be able to understand for decades to come, right? It's a really terrible thing to do to undermine a public health measure like this, because if you create skepticism around one vaccine, then that has the effect of creating skepticism around other vaccines, different vaccines, as well as public health measures overall, right? In the report, it talked about this campaign that the CIA undertook in Pakistan during the early 2010s, I believe, where they created a fake hepatitis B vaccination program. And so they were sending doctors to villages in Pakistan and telling people that they were inoculating them against hepatitis B. But what they were really doing was they were collecting the DNA of people in order to, try and track down bin Laden. And so once this was revealed, it created this huge backlash in Pakistan where it created, skepticism around not only the hepatitis B vaccine, but vaccines overall. And it led to a lot of attacks against healthcare workers that were, trying to do their job. And it created this major backlash in Pakistan where a lot of diseases, that could have been prevented, ended up killing a lot of people. And so, going back to the SINOVAC report, the effects of something like this, we won't be able to understand for years to come. But KJ, I'm curious to know, what responsibility does the U.S. bear in COVID spreading throughout the Philippines and Southeast Asia and derailing their response to this pandemic?
Well, I think the US bears a great responsibility. And I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, Amanda. I don't think it will take us years to figure out what happened. The math is quite simple. There is the R naught, that's the replication factor. We just do the calculations and we can make a reasonable estimate of how many people were affected by this. At the time that the US started this psyop in spring of 2020, there were about 5,000 cases of COVID and 315 total deaths. About a year later in the summer, there were over 1 million cases and about 38,000 deaths. And once again, to look at the daily case rate, in the spring of April, there were about 100 cases a day. And by August of 2021, there were about 20,000 cases a day. So, however you slice it, you can see that the US, to the extent that this psyop was effective, and it seems to have been very, very effective, it bears a great responsibility. I'll say that the psyop is not only responsible for the vaccine resistance, but also this was targeted, as you pointed out, against masks and tests. And these are non-pharmaceutical measures that are essential for preventing the propagation of the virus, of the disease against people who cannot take vaccines. And tests are essential for tracking and tracing. And so it essentially derailed the entire public health system. As you point out, the US has done this before. When it was trying to track down bin Laden, it has essentially undermined public health around the world. But remember, public health is a race between good information and bad information. It's a race between disease and science, but it's also a race between good information and misinformation. And what this shows is that the United States was firmly on the side of misinformation. And because of that, I think we can easily point out that the US is responsible for the deaths of tens, perhaps hundreds, perhaps millions of people. The other thing I'll point out is that there was a global shortage of PPE and a global shortage of vaccines. And at the time, the SINOVAC vaccine, which is shown to be, reasonably effective, was the only vaccine that was available. By preventing the Philippine people, by spreading rumors, dissuading them from taking the SINOVAC vaccine, the US really has the blood of countless Filipinos and other Asians on their hands.
Absolutely. And, we can't emphasize enough how much of a shocking story this is. And reading the report myself, The article had published several quotes from intelligence officials like within the article, and all of them were like, I can't believe that the US would do something like this to undermine public health measures like this. And, these intelligence officials, these representatives of the US government, in their quotes, they seemed really, really shocked. But, if you're familiar with the US and US history, it's actually not as shocking as it may seem, right? They do have a history of doing this. And, we were talking about the CIA operation in Pakistan a few minutes ago, but, the US government has a history of launching these online propaganda campaigns, the sole purpose of which is to sow misinformation for US interests, right? It was just last year that the Washington Post reported kind of a similar story where the Pentagon, again, created fake accounts to spread anti-Russia narratives, anti-Iran propaganda as well. I'm thinking of what happened in 2011 when the U.S. created Zunzuneo, which was a social media platform very similar to Twitter. They launched it in Cuba, and the aim of it was to target Cuban youth and kind of sow frustration and discontent among the youth using that platform, sow their frustration against the Cuban government in the hopes that the youth would kind of rise up and overthrow the government there. This was during the height of the Arab Spring, so that's where, that justification came from. So clearly the US sees a lot of value in these kinds of online propaganda campaigns, and they're constantly using social media to create these narratives much more favorable to U.S. interests. And it is very effective. The report mentioned that the company that was behind this online propaganda campaign was General Dynamics, war profiteer General Dynamics. And even though this psyop campaign ended in 2021, General Dynamics just signed another $500 million contract to continue doing these kinds of online psyop campaigns. So clearly, the US sees a lot of value in social media as kind of a critical terrain for US propaganda. So can you talk a little bit about this kind of information warfare and what it says about the current new Cold War on China?
Yes. Well, what it says about the war with China is that we are already deeply, deeply steeped in war. We're not simply, as some people have said, as Henry Kissinger said, at the foothills of a Cold War. We are at high altitude. And the thing that I always say is that information warfare is the pre-kinetic and the subkinetic dimension of war. The US has a model of hybrid warfare in which it, wages legal warfare, economic warfare, information warfare, cultural warfare, academic warfare. It sees all of these domains as domains to be contested. But one of the most important domains is the information space. And the US always seeks to dominate that. And you can see this in that, there's literally a three-step process that the US engages in when it goes to war. First, it engages in information warfare. Then it engages in shaping the theater, setting the theater of battle, and then it engages in provocation. But regarding the information warfare, in this specific incident, we can see that it was, this unethical psyop shows us two key points. One is that Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said that the United States, he signed a secret declaration stating that the US was in active combat footing with China, and therefore this type of extraordinary psyop was permissible. So the US is no longer competing and cooperating or managing its differences with China. It considers itself to be in active combat footing. I think that's an extraordinary revelation from this article. The other thing that we can point out is that this psyop resulted directly in the loss of life. It wasn't simply a loss of prestige for China, or Chinese diplomats being delegitimated. It was literally, as we pointed out before, it resulted in the deaths of countless people in the Philippines and across Asia. Now, as this hybrid war, which has quite a bit of history, is escalating, we can see that it has already resulted in the deaths of Asians. When you demonize a country in order to manufacture consent for war, of course, some of that is going to blow back. When you prepare to attack and kill Asians over there, you're also going to have Asians over here also be killed. It's just a kind of natural trickle down effect of when you have a wholesale policy of hate mongering, you're going to get retail violence as well. And so we have already seen that in the extraordinary number of attacks on Asians, some of which have resulted in deaths, some of which have resulted in mass killings. But this is just a completely different dimension in that, we're talking about possibly tens, possibly hundreds of thousands killed if we do the calculations.
Right. And I'm really glad that you brought up, this concept of hybrid warfare, because a lot of people just think of warfare in military terms, right? But, a lot of the times the US engages like in a different kind of warfare, like sanctions, using sanctions, blockades, embargoes, and also creating these online narratives, right? They are fighting an information war right now. And of course, you can't fight an information war without, social media platforms, big tech, like Facebook, like Twitter. And I think big tech shares some sort of culpability in all of this. The article mentioned that, sometimes when they found an account was spreading misinformation, they would flag it. Um, but I'm not sure if they took down the accounts or if they just flagged it and then moved on. But can you talk a little bit about big tech's, overall responsibility in all of this, in trafficking U.S. propaganda, and also these kinds of campaigns overall?
Yes. Well, I mean, what's clear is that they did notice these because these were obviously operations. These were, fraudulent accounts. They were using very specific techniques that you notice when you're doing this kind of information warfare. They flagged it and they brought it up with the government. And then they were told that, this was us, this was our operation. And so they did nothing about it. So they were active and functioning for at least a year, possibly longer, but certainly they were having very, very deleterious effects. As we said before, possibly, tens of thousands of deaths. It was really kind of a homicidal, depraved heart murder on an industrial scale. But I think the key thing to understand about this here is that not only was Twitter and not only were the social media corporations directly cooperating and complicit in this psyop, but we have to contrast it with the extraordinary censorship that we saw in the United States. If you remember, anybody who was spreading anti-vax information in the United States had their accounts immediately shut down. You would be put into Twitter jail faster than you could blink. And often people had their accounts shut down completely. And so contrast this extraordinary censorship and monitoring of anti-vax information in the United States with this wholesale propagation of anti-vax information in the third world. And once again, I have to emphasize, these were the countries that were the most poorly equipped to deal with a pandemic of this scale. These were some of the poorest and most underprepared countries to deal with that. And as a result, millions of people died. And I think that the responsibility of the social media companies is extraordinarily high. I think this, as I said, amounts to complicity in depraved heart mass murder.
It is depraved, and it's a criminal campaign, like almost a genocidal campaign. And one thing that struck me when I was reading this article was, obviously to you and me, the U.S. government bears all the responsibility for this. But I noticed, like reading the article, it would sometimes here and there kind of try to shift the blame onto China, right? And it would say, well, this campaign was a response to China's own statements about COVID, China's claims that COVID had actually originated in the US. So, I guess just to play devil's advocate here, a lot of people may read this article and be like, well, at the beginning of the pandemic, some Chinese officials had made public statements that there was the possibility that COVID had actually originated in the US. And, as I said, there are a few times within the article that claim this as well, that the Pentagon campaign was merely a response to China's own public statements and China's own efforts to spread false information about the origins of COVID. And, on top of that, there was already really deep suspicion of China in the Philippines because of Chinese activity in the South China Sea. So I can see how a lot of people might say, this was China's own fault. So I guess I'm interested in hearing how would you refute that? Like, what would you say to that?
Well, I think it's a really, really threadbare excuse because if you look at the impacts that this had, there's no way, even if this was a response to China, there's no way that this could be justified as a proportionate response. But actually, if we look at the facts themselves, even that accusation doesn't hold up. China was not waging some kind of massive psychological operation against the United States regarding COVID. In fact, what it was trying to do was trying very, very hard to put out accurate, good information about COVID. The best example of that is that, within days of isolating the COVID genome, it uploaded it to GenBank, and that happened on January 5th. It was uploaded. The entire genome was uploaded to GenBank on January 5th. It's in the records, and so China was working really, really hard, and it also, took extraordinary measures, some very, very difficult for its own citizens to prevent the spread of COVID around China, but also to other countries. So that is completely unjustified to make that claim. But there were, at the time, the US was making some extraordinary claims about COVID against China. And it is true that some of the Chinese officials and diplomats did respond in strong terms. For example, there was this trope that COVID was a bioweapon invented by China and released deliberately or by accident. So what that ignores is the fact that, the lab itself was funded by the United States, and it was run in collaboration with the French and the United States. And that's an extraordinary thing to be doing if you are, I've never heard of the United States collaborating on bio warfare with a country that it considers itself to be an enemy with, to be on active combat footing with. And then the other thing that we have to note, and this is good evidence that has come out right now, is that COVID was present in Europe and possibly in the United States before it was actually discovered in Wuhan, China. That is to say, if we look at wastewater samples and lab samples, other lab test samples, there's a pretty good, scientific trail that shows that it was evident. It was present in Europe, possibly Italy and other parts of Europe, uh, weeks or months before it was actually found in China. Anything that disregards that timeline is not credible. The only thing that disrupts that timeline is a hearsay article in the South China Morning Post, which I've asked them to verify, and they have refused. So I think that's just information out by SCMP. But coming again back to the point, the Chinese did point out that, if you charge us with biowarfare, then of course we have to think about, Fort Detrick, which literally is a lab for biowarfare because it absorbed, among other things, Unit 731 of the Kwantung Army, which was the biowarfare unit of the Japanese. And so I think, there was some pushback, but that does not justify waging a full scale information warfare operation, which was certainly not what the Chinese were doing. What we do know is right from the get go, when COVID started, the US started using this as a golden opportunity to undermine and attack China. This came in very, very specific phases. In the first phase, when the epidemic broke out in Wuhan, the Council on Foreign Relations said that it was a uniquely Chinese disease, that it wouldn't affect other countries because it was uniquely Chinese, and it was uniquely Chinese because it stemmed out of corrupt authoritarian practices, which is a really, really foolish thing to say. But nevertheless, they put it out there. And then when it became clear that this was a very, very serious global pandemic, China went into lockdown and it essentially threw itself on the epidemiological grenade, if you will. And if you recall, the press in the West, the Washington Post and all the other major press, said that there is no way that these non pharmaceutical interventions could work. They just could not work. And they were simply manifestations of Chinese authoritarianism, that they were using COVID to oppress and control people rather than to actually do public health measures. Once again, completely wrong, completely misguided, because most countries ended up having to do some kind of lockdown or quarantine measures. And then, this third phase was when they threw shade on Chinese masks and Chinese vaccines. And this just was nonstop propaganda, but it really, really created, massive damage around the world. And of course, it also created blowback for the United States.
One thing to keep in mind about this disinformation campaign, and this wasn't included in the article itself, but I found this out like doing a little bit of research after reading this article, was that, this campaign ended in June of 2021. Around the same time, maybe a month before, in May, before they ended this campaign, the Philippines ended up signing its biggest COVID vaccine supply agreement yet at that point, which included around 40 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, the U.S. produced Pfizer vaccine. And since then, Pfizer has become the top COVID vaccine in the Philippines, with a little over 93 million doses administered by the end of 2022. And then SINOVAC was a pretty distant second at 50-ish million, I believe. So I'm constantly struck at the way that the U.S., instead of, they want to compete with China instead of collaborating with China. But they really can't compete with China in tech or like medical innovations. So what they end up doing is just trying to cut them out of the market completely. We've seen this with the SINOVAC vaccine, of course, as we've discussed, but also with Huawei, with TikTok, and also semiconductors. So, it's just this constant inability to compete. So I'm just going to try to like kneecap you and undermine you so that the U.S. can come out on top.
Yes, you're right. I mean, this is what we could see as the Tonya Harding approach to the marketplace. You can't compete, uh, in a level playing field, and so what you do is you go outside of the arena of contestation and you kneecap, as you put it, your opponent. You use any illegitimate, illegal, criminal means to attack or undermine your competitor, and we see this as a constant pattern. As you pointed out, it's what the US is currently doing against EVs and Chinese clean tech. It's trying to prevent, Chinese uh, new developments in diabetes from being propagated in the United States, so that the medical companies can keep their exorbitant profits related to the sale of insulin. They're currently trying to squeeze out Chinese medical research technology companies that have been very, very beneficial to the development of medicine in general. They're doing it with TikTok. They've done it with Huawei, which has created, some of the most important infrastructure around the world, reliable, cheap infrastructure around, internet access. And we see this as a general pattern. I think what it signals is that for the United States, corporate profit, corporate advantage, and geostrategic advantage go hand in hand. They're essentially two sides of the same coin. So if they can undermine the SINOVAC vaccine, so that U.S. corporations can pull ahead and make windfall profits, then they're perfectly willing to do that and disregard the cost that it will incur in terms of human lives and disruption to an entire economy and their public health systems. I think the other thing that's important to point out is that the Sinovac vaccine was developed rapidly, but it was based on an attenuated vaccine that you take essentially the live vaccine, and then you attenuate it so that it can be applied. And this is a very, very old technology. It's a tried and tested technology. It actually derives from variolation, which the Chinese invented about 1,000 years ago for smallpox. So it's a long tested, effective technology. And the technology that the US was trying to foist on the Philippines and all around the world, mRNA vaccines, this was a completely untested technology. It had never been used as a vaccine on human beings before. And so, what we essentially saw with Pfizer and the other mRNA vaccines was the world's largest medical experiment. And I think, the jury is still out, but I think that there is strong indications to show that, the negative effects of this were far in excess of what would have been reasonable and acceptable to a functioning public health system. Certainly, the medical ethics went out the window as far as simply gaining profit is concerned. And I think there are tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who suffered extraordinary side effects because this medicine was not properly tested and vetted. When the CEO of Pfizer refused to take the vaccine, his own vaccine, I think that should have sent alarm bells all over the planet, but it didn't. Instead, he said he was avoiding taking it because he wanted to save the vaccine for other people's. And when you hear, such an extraordinary statement of sympathy and compassion from a pharma tech executive, I think we have to, bring a little skepticism to that.
I like how you put it a few minutes ago that for the US, corporate advantage and geopolitical advantage go hand in hand. And if there's anything that can be taken away from a story like this, I think that's it. But I think that's all the time that we have for this week. KJ, I'll pass it off to you to cap off the show.
Thank you. So I just wanted also to discuss some interesting developments that I saw at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, if you recall, Kurt Campbell, who is the Deputy Secretary of State, uh, is responsible for the pivot to China. He's the person who was literally the architect of this policy of containment, rollback, and essentially war with China. But very, very recently, he had said publicly that the United States needs Chinese students in humanities and Indian students in sciences. So essentially, he's saying that the US should welcome students from China. They're still allowed to come, but they should only study the humanities and not the sciences in the United States. And I just wanted to get your thoughts about that suggestion from Kurt Campbell.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, I feel like there's a little bit of anti-humanities and anti-social science prejudice here, and a little bit of racism as well.
A little
Um,
bit?
yeah, a lot, maybe a lot. Um, okay, so first of all, it's always been a stereotype that Chinese people are really exceptionally good at math and sciences and STEM fields, right? Almost too good, almost to the point where they are seen as robotic and like unfeeling, right? So that's my first thought as a Chinese person who has studied humanities and the social sciences. And another thing is, this goes back to what we were discussing a few minutes ago, which is again, the U.S. cannot compete with China in terms of science and technology, so they would rather, Chinese students not study these fields. And they would rather have like Indian students study these fields, people from a country which are, like more of an ally to the US or have friendlier relations with the US. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but I would double down a little bit on the racism. It sounds essentially that he's trying to create little Bantustans or ghettos inside the academy where students have to study certain types of subjects from certain countries, have to study certain types of subjects, or else there will be consequences. But I think the key thing to point out is that my take on why this is so misguided is that anything university students are studying wherever they're from, anything they're studying or researching is likely to be in the public domain. And if it isn't, it will be soon. There's no such thing as a state secret in academia, except for military projects, and those are designated. So anything that's studied in the academy can be studied outside, and departments and registrars are not supposed to police registration and attendance by ethnicity. It's perfectly possible for a humanities student to take an engineering class if they are capable of doing that. So, is Campbell saying that he wants to put armed guards outside of engineering classes? Does he want registrars to enforce ethnic quotas? Are they going to have little brown bag or yellow bag tests around outside the labs? I mean, this is just, there's a level under which this is just quite extraordinary. And then the second thing that I'll point out to, and I tend to agree with you. I don't think that the humanities are any less important or any less, you know, that Chinese study less of the humanities than the sciences. But the point that I will make here is that Chinese students contribute immensely to U.S. science and technology. As we said in the headlines, Chinese universities are the cutting edge of research. So Chinese students who come to the United States do a very large part of the cutting edge cognitive labor that makes U.S. science and science departments possible. So it makes them strong and competitive. So if Campbell bans Chinese students, it's actually US universities and departments that will suffer, not the Chinese. The Chinese students will simply go elsewhere or they will stay home, and that will increase China's scientific advantages.
All right. Well, that's our anti China clown of the week. And that's our China report for this week. I'm Amanda Yee with my co host.
KJ Noh, good to be with you. And please join us again next week for the China Report.